Neil, before we get into your slides, we're very excited to launch a mass market product with you called Demography Unplugged, which will be available at the beginning of Q2. I think it might be worth, if you could spend a few minutes just talking about this product and your expectations for it, and then we can get into your slides. And we already have a bunch of great questions in the queue for you as well.
Great. I'm really excited about this new product. We're going to, it's going to be a combination of podcast, video, and written reports. We currently do, for some of our other clients, a newswire, a kind of summary of weekly events with a lot of commentary, and that will be available to all participants. Anyway, we got a lot of different stuff we're going to put into this, and I'm excited. The other thing too that I like is I get a lot of email from people asking me to answer questions about, I don't know, a lot of it is what's going on in the market of the world. Sometimes it's just what should they think about their kids. So some of it is just a lot of family stuff having to do with generational relationships. So one of the great things too with this, with the ability to do podcast, is to actually answer questions from people and kind of interact with a broader audience. I've been excited about doing this for a long time.
Great. I know you have a few pretty interesting slides to walk us through, and then we can jump into Q&A.
Well, mainly I just wanted to talk a little bit about where we are in the broad sweep of history, and I get this question a lot, and this is a good chance to just recap it quickly. We have a huge election coming up. In fact, the presidential election season started only weeks after the previous midterm election stopped. So I don't know how many officially announced contenders we have on the Democratic side, but I think it's soon going to be in the double digits.
Yeah, I think it's. I actually looked at this, and I think it's like 9 or 10 already, which is crazy.
Yeah, exactly. It's amazing. I mean, everyone is piling in. The party is moving hugely to the left, and Joe Biden, who's stranded out there as a kind of silent generation centrist, kind of looks out of place. He was widely associated with participating in cracking down on crime back in the mid-90s, and that's coming back to haunt him. He was part of the he was really in charge of the effort to put through that 1994 bill, which Bill Clinton signed, on cracking down on crime. As you know, Daryl, that's when all those Gen Xers were running wild in the streets.
Exactly.
Well, things have changed, and history comes around to a little bit of whiplash. And now, of course, anyone who participated then is apologizing for ever having anything to do with those mass incarcerations. So
Right.
It's going to be a very interesting positioning on this election. Right now, and predict it, the Democrats are already expected to win 62% to 38%. We're not even. I mean, this is January, right, of 2019. And of course, globally, we have the continued movement of populism around the world. This year was definitely the year for Latin America. We had AMLO in Mexico, putting an end to the PRI party, which ruled there for 80 years. And we have Jair Bolsonaro, who's sort of almost the new military dictator of Brazil, and right now presiding, as many of the listeners know, off of actually a huge market rebound in Brazil right now. But we see what's happening with the yellow vest movement. Emmanuel Macron's ratings are down in the low 20s. That's worse than Trump on a bad day. Okay.
Right.
So this is amazing, and we always predicted that Macron would go the same way as that Renzi, that Italian technocrat. By the way, the two of them are close friends. I think the future is much more like what they now have in Italy, which is basically left-wing and right-wing populism coming together, oddly, weirdly, jointly. But anyway, so things are warming up politically. In the economy, the entire global recovery cycle is beginning to wind down. And I'm a firm believer in everything that the macro team says here on quad 4 and quad 3, we're going to go back and forth between those two quads, but it basically means real growth slowing down. Why is real growth slowing down? The fundamental reason is that we've run out of employment, and that's something we cover a lot. If you look at age, sex categories individually, in other words, adjusted by age, we are above the level of employment to population rate that we were at in 2007. The secular trend is these rates go down over time, so I think we're on fumes there. So this is going to go down. And finally, demography.
I was going to say, you can really see the employment trends in this long-term graph that you put together.
Well, yeah, take a look at that.
Yeah.
So this is, and by the way, we're just releasing a piece this morning taking on a recent report by Morgan Stanley talking about the coming youth boom in the economy and how the demographic winds are really at our back coming up. We don't see it. That, by the way, that you just looked at is the Census Bureau projections. Those don't look very encouraging, do they? Take a look at that again. Get it back on the screen again, because I just want to point out that we will have a little rebound. You see in the 2030s and 2040s, those will be the children of millennials. Remember, the millennials were an echo boom generation, and that would be the echo of the echo. So you see how that works. But the 2020s looks unremittingly bad. The average growth rate of the working age population would be around 0.2%. That's just above zero. And why? Because all the boomers are retiring, and this time very small cohorts of late wave millennials and homelanders are coming in. It's going to get better later on. The millennials' kids will be coming in, and Xers will be retiring, and that'll be better. But go to the next slide, because this is kind of interesting. What we did is we did a very simple model of the economy going back, the post-war era, going back to 1960, basically tracking. We made a very simple model of the economy where we just basically said, what if we modeled the economy by just saying the economy every year was going to grow at the rate of the working age population plus the trailing 10-year trend in productivity growth and the employment population growth. So, of the prime age employment population growth. And this is a really instructive graph. You can see, first of all, how our 10-year compounded annual growth rate GDP has hugely gone down, right? We're way down here. We're at this very disappointing level. But you can see what's contributing to it. You can actually see a lot of history in this chart. You can see, for instance, how back in the 70s, all the boomers coming in and all the women coming to the workforce should have hugely expanded GDP, but of course that was counteracted by a huge collapse of productivity and so on. And you can see the problem recently over the past 15 years is that we've been suffering on all counts. That is to say, employment population rate's gone down, the demography has slowed way down, and our productivity growth has come down. So that's a disaster. Now, one last chart. We just project that into the future. Take a look at this. We just assume, this is all written in stone. Those light blue lines, that's just growth rate of the working age population. We assume that there's going to be no net change over time, when women coming in or out of the workplace. And we just take the trailing 10-year productivity growth rate and we cast it forward. Yep. Now you might say, wow, that looks pessimistic. But keep in mind that the IMF right now is already projecting 1.4% by the year, I think it's 2024. The CBO is at 1.8, the Fed is at 1.8. Well, we got 1.3. But if you want to believe the OMB and Mick Mulvaney and go for 3.0, you can do it. But you'd need a productivity miracle we've never seen before. I mean, not even back in the early 60s or 50s. Did you see that?
Is that sort of what the OMB is underscoring in their point, that productivity is going to expand beyond what we've seen?
As Fed Chairman Jerome Powell said recently in a recent speech, he admitted, he said, and we all admit, productivity is the one thing you can't really model, can't really predict. We can predict certain inputs, certain human and physical capital inputs to creating productivity, but most of it is innovation. Most of it is unpredictable. And so you can always wave your hand and say, there'll be a lot of productivity because of our policies. We have that special something, right, that's going to unleash it. But I'm just saying, if you're prudent, if you're realistic, and you do this 10-year trailing average, which is simply what we did. You simply assume the next year is going to be what the last 10 years, the average last 10-year performance is.
Yep.
That's a pretty sobering outlook.
Okay. Got a bunch of questions here for you. The first one I wanted to ask, though, is you talked about this report that Morgan Stanley came out. What if you could sort of summarize it? How is their view so dramatically different than your view? What are they looking at, or what are they seeing that you don't think's accurate or good?
Well, it's interesting. It's not so much that they're it's an odd report, because they actually agree with census. They actually say we can't fault it. We think their assumptions are plausible. It's mainly framing. In other words, it's kind of it's redirection and framing the attention of the reader. They basically say, well, it's going to be a boom because the rest of the world is doing a lot worse demographically. Well, okay, I'm the first to admit that. I mean, I look at Italy and South Korea and Eastern Europe. Fine. And then they also say that the Generation Z coming after, they call it Generation Z, coming after millennials, is a smaller generation, but it's not the huge baby bust that the Xers were. And therefore, because it's not a bust, we're going to call it a boom. I mean, literally, that's what they say in the report. So that's an odd way of lowering the bar, for defining a boom. And then they have a various number of technical things. I mean, we respond to this all in the thing we're coming out with this morning. But it's people just not waking up. This is a very unusual era. This is the lowest working age population growth by far in American history. And it's not going to be that low again until maybe the 2050s or 2060s.
Yep, gotcha. All right, I'm going to put you on the spot for a second on the election, as you touched on. Obviously, to your point, we're a long ways out. But let's get our crystal balls out. Number one, do you see Trump running again, and do you see anybody challenging him? And on the second point, who do you think could win the nomination on the Democrat side? If you look at the polls on the Democrat side, obviously Biden is kind of still polling at the top, but to your point, can he get the base? Is he far enough left? How do you see this election playing out in almost 2 years from now, which is a long way to predict, but I know you always have thoughts on these things.
Well, it's a long way to predict. Look, the idea that an incumbent party would put aside, I should say, a party would put aside an incumbent president who's willing to run for another term, that's never happened before in American history. We've had some incumbents who preferred not to run, the most famous case being Calvin Coolidge. And that was actually the victory because Hoover won. Of course, that's not anything that anyone would like to be as the next Hoover. But my point is that it's never happened where you've involuntarily sidetracked an incumbent.
Right.
That's just never happened.
Yep.
And however, depending on Trump's poll numbers, the economy, and indictments, it could come to that. I know there are a lot of people in the Republican Party who feel they're trapped in a car with no handles. They can't get out. I mean, they're just basically passive, stuck in this thing. They have no choice but to sit there stuck with Trump, and that will be an interesting question. It will be first in American history. Going on to the Democratic side, I think the party has moved to the left. I think they're going to want to energize millennials, and I think this could be a case of populism. The left we're going to see. I tend to favor less the more kind of Marshall McLuhan would have said warm candidates emotion. Kristen Gillibrand and the Kamala Harris's. Harris now actually polls at the top of predicted. I think she's at like 27 cents to the dollar. I favor more the wonkish, more rational side. I favor more the Elizabeth Warren and the Bernie Sanders. I think more of that hard edge economic left is going to do better than that more emotional kind of culture war stuff. I don't think that's going to play very well either in the primaries or the election.
Gotcha. Okay, great. So first question here from subscribers. Neil, what is the biggest risk to American hegemony over the next decade?
Oh, wow.
This could probably be a couple hours we could talk about this.
Well, I think it's the breakdown of the global order.
Right.
And we already see that happening. Keep in mind, when we talked about this period of demographically, the 2020s, this is a global decade of demographic tightness, right? In other words, the whole world is going through this. And in fact, for much of the world, including much of Europe, the maximum increase in the dependency ratio of old people to working age is going to occur during the 2020s. So all those entitlement-heavy states, it's going to get much worse in the 2020s. So compound that. I think that the decade will probably start off with another recession. I mean, we should be realistic. These things kind of go through phases, and I think it could be bad news economically, and I think it could. You don't know what's going to happen.
Yep.
The populist parties in Europe, for example, are generally tend to be anti-EU to some extent.
Right.
They say, yeah, we shouldn't be part of NATO. We shouldn't be part of these globalist mechanisms. And obviously, Asia, I think, is what everyone's looking at. I think that kind of goes without saying.
Yep. This is actually an interesting question. Is there any model for sustainable economic growth for a nation with little or no population growth? Are there examples today, or are we in uncharted territory?
We're kind of in uncharted territory. I mean, people make that point all the time. We have never had a period of stagnating population growth over a large part of the world, except in cases of, a colossal war or plague, that kind of situation. We do know, though, that, and I've written about this a lot. We did a book called The Graying of the Great Powers. We talked about this, that the slowing of the macroeconomy in a secular sense, where, for instance, even in a good year, you may have negative GDP. People don't realize that, but if your working age population is shrinking at 2% per year, and productivity is growing less than 2%, you may have negative GDP in a full employment year. I mean, we can't wrap our minds around that, right? I mean, the whole growth of economics from Adam Smith on was just assumed a lot of population growth.
Yeah.
And what that does is it changes the mentality of market participants. Everyone then, there's no more positive sum game. Everyone wants to protect their share of the market. So the rise of cartelization, the rise of monopoly markets, the rise of protectionism, we saw that in the 30s. This is all an attribute of kind of the zero-sum mentality of stagnant demographics.
Okay. Neil, what do you make of the yellow shirt movement in France? Does this have anything to do with the fourth turning?
It's certainly related to the populism,
yeah.
And it's very interesting. It's so I have this thesis about why. I mean, people say, well, why did you predict that Emmanuel Macron would fail? And we did. And that is the following rule. I always take this rule. It's very difficult for a centrist technocratic leader to be successful. It's like threading the needle to be successful in a country where there are very few moderates.
Right.
People are too much fixated on left versus right. I don't fixate on left versus right. I think left versus right are largely interchangeable. I look at how big the moderates are in the middle. And the point is that Italy and France are both countries in which the moderates are frankly diminutive and impoverished and powerless. And what happens is that it's very interesting now in Figaro with the recent approval ratings of Macron. They're almost as low on the far left as they are on the far right. In other words, on the supporters of La France Insoumise, I think there's the left the left party in France. It's only 5% approve of Macron, and of course the National Front, the right wing, it's only 2%. so the left and right both hate him, and we see the same thing in Italy, and particularly the young, the 25 to 34-year-olds are more negative on Macron than any other age bracket now.
Right.
So, yeah, it's it's part of that general trend.
Okay. A few questions on immigration. First one, how much immigration do we need to sustain a healthy growth rate above 2%? I guess, could immigration be the wild card here, ironically, right now when we're trying to limit immigration?
I used to do that. I used to do calculations all the time. How much immigration would Germany need? How much immigration would Italy need to actually keep their dependency ratios from rising? And it is vast. I mean, it is, there's a reason why we grow our own kids. It's just not plug and play. You need a lot. You need an enormous inflow. I mean, think about it. We have a net immigration to America of, legal and illegal now of around 1 million a year, but we're a pretty big nation. You'd probably need a similar absolute amount in many of these European countries to prevent their demographic ratios from getting much worse. Okay. I guess the point is, Daryl, the bottom line is, yes, immigration helps. There's no question about it. And if you look at one of the reasons why Japan is in such a bad situation is they have just virtually no immigrants. Right. I mean, because in fact, most of these Confucian societies don't really accept or assimilate immigration. But the problem is you need a lot more immigration than even we have now to make a significant difference.
All right. Okay, so for this one, we're really getting the crystal ball out. What do you think of the possibility of a new Bretton Woods agreement at the end of this fourth turning around 2030, which could mean a global common currency and a central bank, global common central bank?
I think there is a possibility of that. At the beginning of the first turnings, historically, would be like, was Bretton Woods and GATT and the IMF and the World Bank and the UN after the Napoleonic Wars, looking at another fourth turning was the Congress of Vienna. In other words, all of the weary and beaten up and exhausted world powers get together and they just said, okay, this whole thing's a mess. Let's redo it from scratch. But they're not going to get there on a sunny day. They're going to get there after things get a lot worse before they get better.
Yeah. Neil, would you compare the demographics of the 1930s, i.e. the Great Depression, to today? Or is that a good analogy?
No, the demographics today are much more adverse.
Yeah.
There's no question. Yes, the certain countries in Europe had lower birth rates, in the 20s and particularly going into the Great Depression. And that factored into the kind of the politics and culture of Weimar. Oswald Spengler with his book, The Decline of the West and so on. He talked a little bit about this decline. But they were just talking about declining rates of growth. They weren't talking about, absolute declines like we're seeing today. So it's much bigger now. I would say the other thing that's very different from the 30s is that in the 30s, countries like, the United States with the New Deal, federal government was very small. So for a new kind of civic generation to suddenly create all these new public works and this huge new role from government, they basically had all this empty space to build on, right?
Right.
Today, we already have this edifice built in, which is already rewarding all the old people. So you have to destroy at the same time you build because there's no room there now. And I think these two attributes, demographically worse, and we now have something we need to tear down before we can build new, right?
Yeah.
Are the two things which actually make it more challenging today.
Neil, you talk about the world not growing, but what about Africa growing exponentially? Does that impact your global outlook at all?
You mean demographically?
Yeah.
Yeah. If you look at the United Nations, and it's very interesting how the United Nations does it, they assume that everyone moves toward gradually replacement rate fertility. It's they have no idea of knowing, of course. But if you look at why the world continues to gain population out in the 2040s and 2050s and 2060s, it's more than all of it is sub-Saharan Africa. Now that's just by assumption. And I have actually questioned that assumption. If you think that Nigeria by the year 2060 or 2070 is going to have a population 3 or 4 times that of Europe in that little country.
Yeah.
Given what they can produce.
It's just not going to happen.
I think I don't think you're being realistic.
Right.
So I actually don't think that's necessarily going to happen.
Okay. We're going to wrap it up with this question, which is, probably a little more of a lengthy answer. But Neil, love your books. Curious to hear you talk about generational archetypes and walk through how that's manifesting today with current generations, millennials, Gen X, boomers, etc.
Wow. You end with a big question.
Yeah, well, I saved that one for the end.
So, we see it today. We do talk about archetypes. The prophet archetype, born after a crisis, indulgently raised, coming of age during an awakening. Obviously, that is today's most hated generation, boomers, right? And they are now becoming today's senior leaders. History shows that is a generation that takes society through the next crisis, right? They preside as elder leaders, senior generation of leaders through the next crisis. And that's kind of where we are. The next archetype is the throwaway kids of the awakening. We call them the nomad archetype. We've seen them in every generational cycle going back centuries. And, in the last cycle, that was the lost generation. The kids who ultimately went to World War I, and they were the midlife leaders of World War II. They were the George Pattons and Omar Bradleys and ultimately Harry Truman and Dwight Eisenhower, right? Belonged to that generation.
Yep.
Today, that's Generation X. Pragmatic, a little bit cynical, very much disconnected from civic life, and they'll go in any direction that works. Very pragmatic.
Yep.
And then finally, you have the final archetype is what we call the hero, optimistic, rational, and team-driven, very much oriented around community. The last time we saw the GI generation, we've seen other generations in our history. We think millennials are of that type, and it's going to be very interesting to see them finally, belatedly, we think this last midterm we begin that, get really engaged politically.
Okay, great. Well, thanks a lot, Neil. Thanks everybody for tuning in. And just, again, a reminder, we're going to be launching Neil's mass market product called Demography Unplugged. It's going to be available at the beginning of Q2, and I think everybody's going to really enjoy that. Neil obviously has a lot of insight on these topics and has written some great books as well that you should take a look at when you get a chance. Thanks a lot, Neil.
Thanks, Daryl.
Thanks.